So I'm going to be talking about critical theory and using a critical management studies approach. And I'm from the discipline of human resources management. So a lot of my work has to do around management and human resources management. And I think this cartoon sort of exemplifies the practice of human resources and, or the way popular culture sees HRM. And it's quite interesting because many of the things that the previous speakers have said, especially Given and Brian, are sort of alluded to in my presentation, and we can talk about that afterwards. So I think the first point about theory is you have to know your theory well. And by this I mean you have to know, okay, so you've chosen your theoretical framework or your theory, know the critique of it, know the limitations of it, know how it's developed chronologically. Given spoke about motivation, for example, and in HRM, it's a very popular topic, but 90% of the sort of motivation theories that we are still teaching our students in HRM are actually empirically, they haven't empirically been proven, for example. And they sort of developed in the 50s and in the 40s and so on. So I get quite worried when I see that a student hasn't really indicated the development of a theory or the limitations or how that theory is sort of how has it been extended, or what are the potential, or what is the potential to extend it. So the sort of theory that sort of informs my work at the moment is critical theory. Now, I think it was in Gibbon's presentation that he said sometimes you have to look outside your discipline. And this is a perfect example of how critical theory has over time sort of contributed to critical management studies theory. So we have sort of social theory that's used mainly in sort of the social sciences, now sort of contributing to the management sciences. Here it's just sort of a brief outline saying that critical theory sort of develops most notably by the Frankfurt School, and it's sort of a response to very sort of huge social upheavals that we're having sort of during the Industrial Revolution, post-Industrial Revolution, and so on. And that was a long time ago, so it's developed extensively since then. And it sort of filters into a number of disciplines, from education, now management studies, and so on. But the sort of premise really is that it sort of rejects positivism, which says that the world is this knowable thing that can be quantified. But it also rejects sort of extreme subjectivism or extreme social constructionism that says everything is socially constructed. The sort of critique is that well, if everything is socially constructed, then how do we investigate or know anything? Is anything sort of knowable? And it's sort of this middle ground, you could say a more pragmatic approach that says there are things that are reified or real in the world. There are social institutions that have been constructed socially, but they exist. But what matters for the critical theorist is your interpretation of those social realities. So your identity as a researcher or your positionality is very important, because if you are a woman investigating some topic, then your gender is quite important. Or if you're a manager as opposed to being an employee, then the way you will look at a topic is quite important. So very, very simplistically, that's sort of a key premise of critical theory. So critical theorists propose that we cannot separate ourselves from what we know, and this inevitably influences inquiry. And maybe this happens a bit more with qualitative research, but often, well, with both types of research, the voice of the researcher is silent. And I think critical theory says that we have to acknowledge our own voices as researchers, that we have to acknowledge who we are and how that relates to the problem that we are trying to solve. So there's none of this objectivity. I'm the researcher, that's the problem. And I'll explain more about that just now. Then the linguistic turn really means that there is this sort of interest in language and the way language creates discourses or ways that we view the world. So given the emphasis on language in critical theory, you'll find that most of our methods and our epistemology, the way we sort of try to attempt to understand the world, is around issues of language. So interviewing, life history interviews, different kinds of qualitative techniques, content analysis, discourse analysis. It sort of lends itself to that kind of methodology. That's not to say that you can't be a critical theorist and do a quantitative project, but then your statistics have to have a theory behind it. And statistics are not atheoretical or without theory. So I just want to talk briefly about Marx and ask, is there a role for Marx in the business school? And I'll leave that as a question, because a lot of the input into critical management studies or critical human resources management actually comes from Marx, who was a political economist, right? A sort of sociologist. And from Paulo Freire, who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So critical researchers draw from outside their disciplines. Power is a really important component of understanding whatever it is that you are investigating. And it's really interested in sort of oppression, exploitation, appropriation. There's sort of critical theory. I think even people in theology and religion sort of do anti-oppressive practice and so on. And it's not value-free. So especially in management studies or in HRM, for example, we have to ask the question, for what purpose does this dissertation serve, or does the study serve? What is the purpose of it? And it sort of challenges this notion that I've now developed a better motivation tool as part of my HRM dissertation. But what is the purpose of that motivation tool? Who does it assist? Does it assist a new managerial elite? Does it assist the employee? All those kinds of questions. And the last sort of feature is it's sort of supposed to be emancipatory, right? It's supposed to have, I suppose some people see it as a political project, sort of making free, emancipating, or emancipation. So it should have those sort of features broadly. But given I think is getting worried, what are the core constructs of critical management studies? And the words or the concepts, the constructs are in red. And you can't have a critical management studies without these three constructs. Reflexivity, it's also called critical reflexivity, anti-performativity or critical performativity, and denaturalization. Those three constructs are key to doing critical management studies. Now, I've said that it has drawn from critical theory more broadly, and the sort of broader concepts that it draws from critical theory, sort of generic critical theory, is sort of political economy, power, it's beyond ethics, beyond human relations, it's emancipatory. But so you can bring these parts, these constructs into your research, but you really can't do your research without those first three. So your research questions have to involve those three quite explicitly, and I'll try and show you how I've done that. So the first thing that you need to do, that I've done, is define or give very sort of concrete or as concrete as possible definitions to those three constructs. So anti-performativity simply means that management and organizations should not be or are not the outcomes of the instrumental rationality of the knowledge produced by managers. Basically, it means that the purpose of the organization of management studies or of managers is not just to increase performance, right? So performativity, performance. That we shouldn't, that the intellectual project or the intellectual purpose of management studies should be more than just about performance, motivation, productivity, as seen in a narrow way. So I've defined this, and there are sort of different ways of defining this. Some critical management theorists say this is too radical and we should talk about critical performativity. But let's just, for the sake of the presentation, we'll just stick with anti-performativity. So you can see that immediately this lends itself to a number of possible research questions depending on the context of the study. Denaturalization. So this really means creating some kind of dissonance or uncomfortableness with the way mainstream concepts or language is being used. So it's sort of, I think it will become clearer with the examples, but it's sort of saying, let's look at the organization as a place where there are these intense sort of battles around power and hierarchy and what is seen as legitimate and illegitimate around the purpose that HRM policies serve, and etc. It's sort of taking things that are supposed to be natural and common sense. Oh, it's common sense that I will be motivated by a higher salary. But is it, right? What does the research show? So your research questions can be informed by this concept, this construct of denaturalization. And then reflexivity. So reflexivity can be personal, it can be more public. And remember that I said in critical theory that who you are, your identity, your position, or we call it positionality, is really important. So reflexivity from a personal point of view says, okay, I'm writing about female managers, for example, but I'm a male. What possible sort of biasness or my own stereotypes, even, I may think, I'm a feminist, I don't have any of these issues, but you'll be surprised that when you do this sort of critical kind of reflection, that you find that your own value systems creep into the way you write or the way you do your research, and so on. So how does your own position, if you're a manager, for example, writing a thesis on an HR issue, your sort of purpose may be quite different, right? So this comes back to the idea that our research in management studies is not value-free. And then I've got sort of public or broader reflexivity, which is we need to reflect on broader political economy issues. I mean, at the moment, we're going through one of the greatest upheavals, I think, since the Industrial Revolution in terms of financial crises. And it's sort of really changing the way we think about work and management and HRM. And that's really a rich space to inform or to reflect on, especially with the downgrading of all our banks today, that's a whole other story. I'm just going to quickly say one thing about theory. Critical management studies relies on a particular way of knowing the world, which is referred to as critical realism. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but whatever theory you choose, you need to find out, well, what is the methodology or the epistemology, the way that other scholars who have used that theory, have they mainly done quantitative research? Is it possible to do it quantitatively or qualitatively, and so on? So that's quite important that you match or align your methodology with the type of theory or conceptual framework that you have chosen. Okay, so now let's get to the actual empirical work. So the first project that I'm involved in is around the way professional work is changing in South Africa and around the world. And I've particularly looked at histopathologists who are sort of they are medical specialists that are highly skilled, that are involved in biopsy diagnosis, right? So they've had like 11, 12 years of training, and there are very few I think in the whole country there are less than 200, and in the province there are about maybe 20. And so I went through various of these processes in exploring these constructs to come up with my research questions. Firstly, with reflexivity. This was a personal reflection on how my own professional life was changing, right, in an organization. That it was becoming more geared to sort of a productivity, it was becoming performance, performativity, all those things. And I wondered, I said, oh, okay, I have a PhD. Should I really be monitored in the same way? I'm losing my autonomy. But maybe it's not unique to being an academic. And I said, okay, well, let's see what other professionals like lawyers and engineers and medical specialists are experiencing. And they're all experiencing the same thing. So that broad question came through a process of reflexivity. It produced that dissonance. Then I borrowed a concept from sort of political economy, which is, well, why is work changing for professionals globally? Does it have to do with the way economy is changing? Then then I looked at the issue of denaturalization, right? So we constantly told, if you become an engineer, if you become a doctor, if you become an accountant, you're going to enjoy job security, you're going to enjoy autonomy, and all those things, job security. That's simply not true. There's a general and global erosion of professional, of what it means to be a professional. So that really sort of turned the mainstream HR thinking on its head. And then anti-performativity. Now, the interesting thing about these histopathologists is that they sort of monitored in the same way as call center workers. They have to get so many diagnoses out a day. And if you want to make partner, you have to get out even more. And, so you think, okay, how, reliable is my cancer diagnosis or whatever.